orchid creature. She's like an orchid in her bed of dirt, just a root drinking silently, a mouth that sucks and sucks at nothingness. Her shirt is draped on the chair, bodiless, without a thing to fill it up. She lies in bed because without the drug, she cannot stand her mind. She's slack and empty. She has shed her life and lives with naked nerves instead of skin. She'd like a life. She lies beneath a sheet and doesn't move. She's gone too deep. She's like a creature sipping her own blood. She's lost inside the tangle underneath. She's like a body without soul. She sleeps. She cannot stand herself. She lies in bed.
Tony Barnstone, you grew up in a family where everybody was an artist. Your father, Willis Barnstone, is a well-known poet, highly acclaimed, also a translator, among other talents that he has. Your mother is a graphic artist. I think she works with textiles.
Textiles, also with acrylic and with pastels.
And your sister is a poet and translator. And when was the first time you said, I am a poet, aloud?
That's a good question. I think that, versus I write poetry, I think maybe in my mid-20s. Yeah, it took me a long time. It took me a long time to like my own work. I had higher standards than I had abilities.
You have published many books of poetry. We have Naked, Magic, Impure, Sajas, The Golem of Los Angeles, Tongue of War, and a manuscript that is going to be published soon called Buddha in Flames. You have also translated poetry from Chinese and Spanish. But you started as a free verse poet.
Yes.
But then you have developed this attraction to forms, particularly the sonnet.
Yes.
And you explain very well that the sonnet is a good tool, it's a good storytelling tool.
What I like, a lot of things I like about the sonnet. One of the things I like about the sonnet is that its basic structure is the same structure as that of a good play or a good short story or a good movie. You start out with the introduction of conflict. It rises up about 2/3 of the way through the sonnet to the turn where the conflict turns, and then you move towards some form of resolution, and that's dialogical, this but that, this however. And that's the structure of the Italian sonnet. The English sonnet, on the other hand, takes that last 6 lines, the sestet of after the turn, and takes the last 2 lines and makes it a couplet with a secondary turn, so that what ends up happening is the structure becomes this, but that, so that. So it becomes dialectical. And in this way, it's the same structure of short story where you introduce conflict, rise up to a climax, you have a falling action to a resolution, and then you might have a little coda if you're doing something like the, or a little twist at the end, a little O. Henry twist if you're doing something like the English sonnet.
Which, when you say sonnet, normally you associate it with, like, you know, old books, old times. How do you make them current?
I used a free verse aesthetic for my early sonnets, most of the sonnets in the book Sad Jazz, for example. And by that I mean that they were formally regular and they rhymed, but I expanded what I considered rhyme to be. So, for example, I might have a rhyme in Tongue of War, my more recent book, in which the rhymes are what I call reverse rhymes, where the words, it's like lack and call. Right?
Okay.
Where they don't rhyme, but they're actually phonetically the reverse from each other. Yeah. So they share all the nouns and all the consonants rather, and all the vowels. And so that's kind of a way of twisting the rhyme so that it opens up the palette of what's possible. The second thing I like to do is to especially come up with a vernacular speech, which many ways goes against the form, against how we think of the form as being formal. So vernacular speech, but formal form, in a way, makes it contemporary. That's particularly what I did in Tongue of War, which was all dramatic monologues spoken from the point of view of American and Chinese and Japanese veterans and civilians who went through World War II.
Yeah. Going back to the two books, Satyas and Impure, do you think that some of these books are connected to confessional poetry?
A couple things. One thing I'll say is that there's a lot of bad confessional poetry, and but the original confessional poets weren't writing the bad confessional poetry. It partly had to do with the fact that they were well trained, so they knew their form, but they abandoned their form in order to write confessional poetry.
Okay.
They would adapt it a bit to free verse, as was the case with Robert Lowell, who then later went back and started writing sonnets again, just unrhymed. And certainly Sylvia Plath knew her form very well, and Sexton could get by. But what was interesting to me when I look at confessional poetry and think, what can I steal from these guys, and what's lacking in a lot of contemporary American confessional poetry, it's what I call performative speech. It's a linguistic term that refers to that kind of speech which performs a social action. So a curse, a promise, a whine, a suggestion, etc. All these are forms of speech that fiction writers know make dialogue interesting. What the confessional poets did a really good job of was to do, for example, what Robert Lowell says in one of his poems, Skunk Hour, "My mind's not right." My mind's not right. That sorrowful confession of his own mental illness, you know. What Anne Sexton said in an interview is that I'm an actress on my own autobiographical stage. So she's not just confessing her life, she's acting, she's dramatizing her life. And so I search in my own confessional poetry for that kind of dramatic speech.
The Tongue of War, in the introduction you explained that originated in 1995. You had a dinner with Brigadier General Paul Tibbets.
That's correct, yeah.
And that was like the trigger of the... Could you expand this a little bit?
At that time, I was married to a Japanese woman. She later became an American citizen. And her parents came from Fukuoka, where... a town which had suffered one of the towns that had suffered firebombing during World War II, and so on the one hand, when I was invited to have dinner with Paul Tibbets, the man who piloted the Enola Gay, which was the plane that dropped the atom bomb on Hiroshima, I had some kind of reservation. I mean, like any good liberal, I would have a reservation about a man who had killed 100,000 civilians. But also in part because I was connected to a Japanese family. On the other hand, my father had told me, when I had these discussions with him growing up about the ethics of the atom bomb, that he was drafted and was one of the soldiers who probably was going to have to go and invade the mainland of Japan, an invasion which they thought certainly was going to kill a million American soldiers. And so he probably would have died, in which case I probably would never have been born. So here I was sitting down with Paul Tibbets, knowing that on the one hand, because of this man, I exist.
And because of this man,
100,000 people died of the ethnicity that my wife and children would be coming from. So that was a complicated situation. Out of those complications and out of my own questioning of Tibbets' morality of dropping the bomb in our conversation.
Because he says that everybody's guilty.
He says that in total war, everyone is part of the war effort, even babes in arms, and they all deserve to die. It's a very strong point of view. Okay. So I began to think, well, what would a child in Hiroshima think of the atom bomb dropping, killing their parents and destroying their household? What would someone, a scientist like Oppenheimer think? What would Gandhi think? What would Truman think? So I began to look at interviews and diaries and letters, and to do my own interviews with veterans and their families to try and find these stories and to put them into sonnet and other forms, so that became the genesis of the book.
You define the style of the book as objective poetic journalism.
Yes.
That's what you said in one of the interviews. Do you mind reading one of the poems from?
This is a poem that is interesting in a couple of different ways. Its genesis is based on an interview with an with a Navy nurse who was stationed in the Philippines in 1942. And then I added certain details in from a poem by Walt Whitman from his Civil War series. It was called "A Mark in the Ranks, Hard Pressed, and the Road Unknown." So a lot of the surgery details actually come from Walt Whitman.
Okay.
In a sense, it's not really objective poetic journalism here because I'm blending in a literary text with an interview. And here it is. It's called "Hospital Tent." I looked around the scene and saw the men, some dead, some twisting on the tables. Smell of antiseptic, smell of blood. And then I looked outside where more waited. I tell you, I knew nothing of the Philippines, of mangoes, of houses on stilts, nipa huts, the smell of copra in the air, gangrene and amputations, lice, the surgeon's cuts I had to sew back up, of caribou, the glisten of small steel instruments catching the glint of lantern light, red pile of gauze. But still, I never cried until one day when I didn't see how. My hand was grabbed as I passed by, intent, by a young man who gave me half a smile and held me with his hands and eyes, then died. Now, going back to our earlier conversation, I think it feels like a spoken poem, but it's iambic pentameter, and it's a Meredithian sonnet, a 16-line sonnet. And so a lot of my aesthetic coming to the sonnet as a free verse poet is to read something like that and make it feel like, I hope, someone's speaking to you. And yet, if you look on the page, you say, oh, damn, that thing rhymes.
You do that in many levels. You the blending. For example, before you read the poem, you talk about Walt Whitman. So you blend a tradition and a previous poem into your own poem, and then you blend the format with something that feels very oral, very colloquial. It's an extraordinary book, and it has become a CD. Is that right? The Tongue of War now is called Tokyo's Burning.
Sure, let's hold it up for the camera.
Yes.
Can you see okay?
Never had left Kansas until I had to wrap them up in canvas.
So this CD, it took me several years to put out. It was a collaboration that I did with two singer-songwriters, John Ciardi and Ariana Hall. Really quite gorgeous singers, wonderful songwriters. And what we did is we took a number of the poems from Tongue of War and turned them into 15 different songs.
Did you have to change a lot of the text, or in many cases, a lot or a little bit, or it was different in every case?
The basic answer to your question is this. A sonnet, most of these poems are sonnets, has a certain structure that I described before. A song, particularly the kinds of songs we were writing, which is sort of alt country or folk songs, has a different structure, and that structure is verse, refrain, bridge, verse. It doesn't have to be exactly like that, but that's the basic structure. And so you have to do a couple of things. One, you have to find out what is the refrain. Well, the refrain is what is often the last line of a poem, which is to say the heart of the poem, the twist of the poem, the thing that you remember when you walk away from the poem. So in a song, the thing that you sing again and again is your hook, and it's often the same thing as the title of the song. And the next thing you determine is what your verses are going to be and how they're going to move the story along, separated by these choruses. And then the next thing you have to do is determine where your rhymes are and how you can amp them up. Instead of making my poem sound like someone speaking, I'd have make my poem sound like somebody singing. And somebody singing has true rhymes. It's sing and king.
And you have collaborated with other media artists, with sculptors and also illustrators. I think you have a book that is coming out.
It's called Pulp Sonnets. It's another answer to your question, how do I make the sonnet contemporary?
Contemporary, yeah.
And this answer is use fun material. And so I decided to write a book of sonnets based on popular fiction, comic books, B-movies. So werewolf poems, vampire poems, zombie apocalypse poems, sword and sorcery, descent into the underworld poems, film
So
noir
a
poems.
lot of pop culture.
Pop culture stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then I've been working with an artist named Amin Mansouri, who was a professor of art at the University of Tehran in Iran. And so he's taking my poems. Here's one called The Cat Lady, and then doing very interesting illustrations based on them. Some of them are quite illustrative. Some of them are more abstract.
I have one question about your book Impure, and also is connected to the manuscript Buddha in Flames.
Yes.
You do something that I admire and I envy. You, the focus of the poem starts in one point,
Yes.
and then you move it to another point, and then to another one, and the movement feels a little bit disjointed or juxtaposed, almost surreal in a way, but not purely surrealistic. But then at the end, the poem reveals itself like a very cohesive unity.
Yes.
Do you have a name for that kind of leap of faith that you do? And so what's the name of it, and how do you do it?
As a code I had to crack.
Okay.
I was looking at the poetry of Tony Hoagland. I was looking at the poetry of Robert Hass, and the poetry of what later became the book The Want Bone by Robert Pinsky.
Rampinski, okay.
And trying to understand how they did exactly what you're talking about, how they wove together disparate images, anecdotes, places, and somehow made it all cohere. And it took me a long time to understand how to do it. I understand it in terms of metaphor, which is to say, what is metaphor? Metaphor, you say this is that.
Yeah.
When you say this is that, it's you're saying that this is that because of some characteristic they have in common, some superordinate category that takes those two categories and joins them together. So the question then becomes, if I put this and I put that into a poem, but I don't say this is that, but they're there, and those categories, that superordinate category is resonating between them. My term for this is conceptual rhyme.
Conceptual rhyme, okay.
Which is to say that the concepts rhyme because of the nature of metaphor and how the brain categorizes. So what I will often do is, when I'm in the process of brainstorming a poem, I might have an anecdote. And so sometimes I do this self-consciously, sometimes I do it instinctively. Is I will cluster an image or cluster a phrase, and I will begin to say something like airplane, and then I'll take airplane, I'll start going wings, nose, windows like eyes. So the airplane is a person with wings. The airplane is an angel. So now I have airplanes and I have angels. Okay. Airplanes dropping bombs, closer to devils, the opposite of angels, and so on. And so I begin to start thinking laterally about the ways in which things connect.
In Impure, you do that, but in the manuscript, the Buddha in Flames, it is stronger, produces a more, I call it dizziness in the reader.
Yeah.
It is a good dizziness, but I think it's, I don't know, probably you have more experience with the technique.
The reason is, I think it has a lot to do with my reading of Jung.
Oh, okay.
And my understanding of the archetype.
Okay.
Which is to say that, as you see, my way into the poem, the way of cracking the code, although everything I'm doing is elliptical and instinctive, it's also intellectual. I'm using intellectual techniques to find my way into the underworld. But the underworld, the world of dream, the world where everything blends together, is the place where metaphor lives. You know, if in my dream you appear and start talking to me, it's me who's talking to me with your face.
Yeah.
It's metaphor incarnate, right?
Yeah.
So the question is, how do you enter the underworld? How do you descend, as with Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, how do you descend into the underworld to fight the monster and get the treasure of the unconscious, like Beowulf fighting Grendel and grabbing the sword, or entering the dragon's lair? How do you do that? Well, you can do it intellectually in the way I just did, or you can do it much more instinctively. And so increasingly I've been trying to not understand my poems.
Excellent. That's a very good idea.
Yeah,
a very
and
good
I can
idea.
understand it later, but to put in something I don't understand and make it somehow resonant and interesting. And my interest here is very much the deep image poets like Robert Bly or James Wright, or the surreal poets of Latin America and of Europe, especially Trakl and Georg Trakl and Federico Garcia Lorca and Octavio Paz.
You have translated from Spanish, I
Yes.
think,
Mainly Borges.
mainly Borges and Paco Brines, I believe.
That's true, yes.
And also from Chinese.
Yes.
What have you found in translation?
It's a form of spirit possession. When I translate the 7th century Chinese poet Wang Wei, that man speaks through me when I write his poems. Jorge Luis Borges, a man I met, who's now dead, but nonetheless, when I translate him, I feel his spirit going through me into his verse. Another way of putting it is, I feel his aesthetic spirit coming alive in my poetry, that is his poetry with my name on it, which is what we call translation. So when I write my own poems, I have Wang Wei's spirit, I have Borges' spirit,
Yeah.
I have all the people I've translated or read carefully enough that I feel that I've translated them, such as Robert Pinsky.
Yeah. Do you have insecurities as a writer?
Fewer and fewer.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah, I would say that...
Or fears.
yeah,
Do you have a
of
fear?
course I have fears, yeah.
What's your major fear?
One always fears criticism. You know, one fears that that one's poems might be taken the wrong way, especially by some PhD student with a chip on his or her shoulder.
Okay.
You know, like a theoretical chip. That's always a fear. You know, so there's that. And also, one writes thousands of pieces, and it's easy to kind of essentialize one position and sort of take that as the position of an entire lifetime, when in fact one's moral being is complex, and it evolves from what I believed when I was 17, what I believed when I was 30, what I believed when I was 40. I think as I get older, I become wiser in ways that are painful. I've learned more about the sorrow of the world. It's made me more human. And so some things I might have joked about when I was 30, I probably wouldn't joke about today. So that's one fear. Another fear I have is that a deep fear I have is that I will not live up to my responsibility, to my talent. It's a talent that I didn't have when I started, but that I devoted myself to with absolute obsession for 20 years until I could figure out how to write a poem. I really wrote nonstop from the time I was 17 to the time I published my first book when I was 37. And I was slow developing and really stubborn. And I feel I owe that process, which is really a lifetime, not to throw it away on cheap poems or on poems that were sloppily published, or some poems that I didn't think all the way through, or poems I didn't relentlessly revise until I felt they were done before I published them.
Would you mind reading the poem from, I think it's from Impure, the poem Desire,
Sure.
that I think is a good example of this conceptual rhyme.
A lizard visits me each night, squat against my window pane, snake-headed, with Buddha's eyes. Frail legs hold the fruit of its body to the glass. In China, the dragons are so huge, their spines are spiked mountain ranges, armored with pine trees. Whole villages spilling light are their lamplit eyes, and they breathe typhoons, lick lightning with their tongues. But your gray body, smaller than my little finger, curls against the square page of window light like a question mark. It makes me think how on rare nights when I was young, a great Luna moth, wings larger than my father's hand, came from somewhere deep in the woods, like a dream emerging from a darkened mind, and tapped against my window. It was almost human in appearance, a gentleman in white tails pirouetting on the stoop as he waits to be let into the dance. I felt favored My house was chosen by this bright creature and slipped the window open to let it flicker into my living room. I watched it blunder in white confusion against walls of bright sheetrock, then try to enfold the lamp's burning globes in its flammable wings like a moralist's figure for the dangers of lust. I had to catch it, fluttering in a box like a heart, and rush it onto the porch, into the woods, before it beat itself to death against the cardboard. Sometimes you need to be let inside, even if it kills you, risking AIDS or screaming outside your lover's house till you're taken away. Tonight, though, I'm happy simply for the company of this non-entity among dragons, grasping at the light in tiny desire, the scritch, scritch of miniature claws scrabbling against the glass that holds it back from the world, inverted in its alien gaze.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.